So writing a CV. Okay, now then. Oh, this is what I wanted. So CV. So it stands for curriculum vitae, which basically is Latin for course of life. In the United States, I think they sometimes refer to it as a resume, but it's the same thing. And it's a short summary of your personal details, your qualifications, and your experience. And that's it, right? The thing is, the thing that makes this complicated is that there really isn't a standard format. And often some jobs you apply for will say that this is the style of CV they want you to submit, or they'll tell you what you want to put on, or the way they want you to organize it. So there isn't a standard format, but there are certain things that you would expect to put on a CV regardless of where you're applying. And that's really what I'm going to talk through today. My advice is to start off with a master CV. So as I go through these slides, I'm going to talk about things like the most relevant details. What I mean by that with the master CV is perhaps the things that you think are most important. But, and I'll say this again, when you actually submit a CV for a job, you should go back and review it, and you should rejig it so that the most relevant things are the things that are most prominent. There are lots of templates out there. If anybody uses LaTeX, that gives you some nice examples. There are different ones on Word. You can download stuff. There are loads of things. And that's one of the reasons why I haven't actually included an image of what a CV looks like. I have got a slide in a moment with a Google search, so you can see the kind of layouts that you can go for. But basically, I would suggest that you have a look and choose the one that you think is the most attractive. And there are different ways of doing it. So there's templates. You need to consider the layout of your CV. You need to consider the fonts that you're going to be using, the colors. I'll come back to that in a second. And of course, most importantly, and although it is last, I do think it's the most important thing, and that's spelling and grammar. If there's some obvious spelling and grammar mistakes in there, it doesn't matter how lovely your CV looks, that's going to have an impact on whether it actually goes any further. So for templates, choose them with care. There are lots out there. I would advise you to pick something that's quite simple and straightforward. But in terms of styling, you can have things organized in rows or things organized in columns. And when we get to the slide with the different ones on, you'll kind of see what I mean. You need to consider how you can make it stand out, but there's a proviso there in that a CV usually goes through gatekeepers. So there are people who are looking to see whether actually your CV should go any further. And the ability to make your CV stand out visually, and I am talking about visually, is of limited use. It might initially get someone's attention, but if the other things aren't there, then it's not going to go any further forward. And as I've already mentioned, there are templates in Word, and there are some nice templates in LaTeX as well. So this was just a basic Google search I did yesterday afternoon for some images, and you can see the difference between the CVs that are columnar and those that are organized in rows. There are some nice column ones here. That one in the middle that's got 500 plus CV examples, that's a nice example of columns. Some of them use 3 columns, so you'll have a column on the outside and a column on the right and a column on the left. But again, you know, my advice to you is to just have a look and see what you like the look of. What is most attractive to you? There's one there on the right-hand side, jobs in Spain, with a picture, somebody's picture on. I wouldn't recommend that you do that. You don't need to. You don't need to put an image of yourself anywhere. And I would suggest that actually it's probably not a good thing to do. Unfortunately, we judge people initially on the way that they look. And we also know, unfortunately, that people are judged positively or negatively depending on who's doing the looking. And so I think if in an effort to keep any kind of bias out, and I'm talking unconscious and unintended bias here, then it's probably best to not have an image. Okay, so fonts, colors, spacing. Some key rules: no more than 2 different types of font. Don't go experimenting with all sorts of fancy ones, right? Keep it simple, keep it straightforward. Something like Times New Roman is probably a little bit dull. Tahoma's a nice one. So those kind of fonts work really well. Don't go mad with sizing. If you've got a lot to put in, don't make it too small. If you haven't got a lot to put in, don't make it too large either. So I'm saying 16 ppt is the maximum size, but I'm thinking of headings there, not for the actual body of the text. Okay, so think about what you're doing there. A lot of CVs are printed out before they're looked at, and that will be in black and white. So bear that in mind when you're thinking about colour. I do say on a further slide, print it out in black and white first yourself, and because if you've used colour, and make sure that the colour that you've chosen comes across in black and white. What you don't want to do is choose a light colour and then find actually when it's printed out that it's really very pale and it's not noticeable at all. So give it a test. And keep lines and other decoration proportional. So what I mean by that is that it's perfectly acceptable to have lines between paragraphs, but they shouldn't be thick and heavy and they shouldn't dominate the look of your CV. So keep them proportional. So again, you know, you just need to have ultimately when you think you've finished, you need to print it out and then make a judgment as to whether the sizes of things works as an entire document. Line spacing. So I recommend 1.5 lines spacing between each line of text. Don't cram stuff in if you've got a lot to say, and conversely, don't overly space things out if you haven't got a lot to say. If you go for 1.5 spacing and you can't get everything in, well, you're probably going to have to do a bit of pruning. One of the most important things about a CV is, unless you're well down your career and you've got lots of publications and you've done loads of public engagements, your CV should be limited to 2 pages, 2 sides of A4. And actually, even people with a huge publication history, the first 2 sides of their CV will be the kind of the core stuff, and everything else comes afterwards, because it's important, but it's not as important as those first 2 sides. And space it proportionally. So it's a judgment call whether you should squeeze things slightly into 1 page or whether actually you should increase the spacing and move over to 2 sides. Okay, it really depends on ultimately how the document looks. What you don't want to do is make it look like you've got almost nothing to say and you've spread it out as far as possible. Conversely, you don't want to look like you've squeezed it in, because that also is quite off-putting. And again, as I've said here, test the use of colour with a monochrome print. That's really important. So when we come to the structure and layout, you need to include some personal details, but they don't have to be huge. And one of the first things you need to think of is your personal email address. So is it appropriate? So we've all had some silly email addresses when we were kids. You know, we've made up something that we thought was funny. When you become an adult, when you're looking for a serious job, that funny email address is probably not what you want to be using this time. So make sure it comes across as professional. It should obviously be your name, but I know that isn't always the case with lots of them, but just make sure it's sensible. I've said before, there's no requirement to include a photo of your or any gender details on your CV. In fact, I would say leave them out. There's no need to put them there, so don't. You can include a birth date if you like. That's up to you. I don't. Because again, it comes down to this kind of the person that's making the judgment as to whether you're going to go through, or people. There may be some bias. They may be looking for somebody within a particular age range, instead of looking at, is this the best person for the job? And if you've given them some clues and you're not fitting into what they're looking for, then you might not get through to the next bit. So I would think about whether you want to put your birth date on, and I would suggest probably not. Again, you know, I'm talking about bias, and I'm not suggesting people deliberately look for ways to not put people through to the next bit. often bias is just unconscious. It's just something that we all do, and it's very hard to avoid it. When you're doing your CV, try not to increase the possibilities of that happening, I guess is what I'm saying. You need to put a contact address there as well, wherever that might be, whether it's your home or whether it's your university or wherever is appropriate, but there does need to be a contact address. Okay, let's move on. Have I gone too far? No. So I thought I'd give you an example of the last CV that I put together. Now, I was applying for a job in academia, actually. This is my application for a teaching fellow at the University of Southampton. And so the format for me was slightly different. I looked at templates for academics CVs. And this was the kind of thing that was suggested. And you can do this as well. So I started off with a personal profile where I'm just talking very generally about the kinds of things I did before I came to the University of Southampton. And then I also listed my key skills. And remember, I was going for a job as a teaching fellow, which obviously I got. So the first thing in key skills is about teaching, because those were the skills that the position was looking for. And so I highlighted those. I've also got some other things here: independence, written, verbal and presentational skills. So there's some other things there. I would tweak those key skills every time I applied for a different job, because the skills that are needed may not be the same. So I would suggest, if you use key skills, that's something that you do as well. I then went on and put my education, and this is something that you can do. You start with your latest, the last thing first. So the last thing I did before I applied for this job was my PhD in web science. And you can see when I did this, I hadn't actually submitted my PhD, and so I hadn't been awarded it. So I'd put here that this was expected. This was what I was expecting to get. And when it comes to your educational qualifications, if you're still in the middle of doing something, then you can put down what you expect to get, as well as what you've already achieved. And there are the other things. So for me, it finishes with my first degree. With you, I would suggest that it finishes at high school, so A levels. I'm realise I may be talking to some international students here, so you may call it something different. But the exams you did when you were 18 before you went on to further education or higher education, it would probably end there. Most CVs don't want you to go back any further, because those kind of early stuff is less important. And then the next bit for me would have been appointments. So this is where it slightly deviates from a typical CV template, because for me, I needed to show what I'd already been doing, what kind of positions I'd already held. So that's why that's there. Okay, so qualifications start with the most recent and most relevant. Okay. And I've said, if you're still in higher education, you can think about what you're expected to achieve, and that can go in there. And as I said, it's not usually necessary to go back to O-levels, GCSEs as they are in the UK. So those exams that you would have done at 16, you probably don't need to include those. Unless you haven't got a lot on your CV, you'd actually like to pop something in to use up a little bit of space, in which case you might want to pop them in. Okay, so this, it's a judgment call depending on how much is in your CV. And in terms of qualifications, think about other things you've done. So you may have done MOOCs, a massive open online course, right? It doesn't matter whether you got the certificate or not. Did you complete the course? If you did, and if it's relevant for the job, you should put it in. Actually, I think even if it isn't necessarily relevant for the job you're applying for, if you have space, if it's not cramping things, then put it in anyway. The reason is that it shows that you're an independent learner, that you're prepared to do things over and above the minimum that you're expected to do in order to get your degree or your master's or wherever it is you are. So put them in. You know, there's nothing to lose and everything to gain. And anything else that you've done of your own, off your own back, put that in as well. Space permitting, all right? So don't put it in and cram everything up. But if you've got space and it's useful information, then put it in there. And like I said, it says something about the kind of person that you are. So your qualifications layout, I would suggest that you use bullet points. And in terms of bullet points, keep it simple, right? Circles or squares, solid color, preferably. Don't get carried away and do fancy stuff. Just keep it nice and simple. Consider also putting your qualifications in columns. So again, this is a nice way of spacing. So rather than just one list, which kind of sits to the left of your document and probably isn't very, it doesn't take up much of the width of the paper. So divide it into 2 columns and do it that way. Make sure things line up. I know Microsoft Word can be an absolute nightmare when it comes to margins and stuff, but it's worth taking time to make sure that things line up properly, because as you know, for as computer science students, the one thing that we're really good at is picking up things that don't fit into the pattern, right? We spot those immediately. And if anything doesn't line up, that's where the eye is going to be drawn. Now, aesthetically, it doesn't make any difference. But what it says is that you didn't take the time to have a final look and make sure that everything looked okay. And if you don't take the time for that on your CV, how does anybody know that you're going to take the time to do it in your job? So definitely have a look. And better still, when you think you've done, give it to someone else to have a look. And I'll come back to that in a bit. And as I said again, pay attention to spacing, to font, and to the colours. There's nothing stopping you using colour in a CV, by the way. It can look visually, it makes it look really good. And I know I said earlier that most gatekeepers will print CVs out, but that isn't always the case. And actually, if your CV looks nice in terms of colour, that can be quite beneficial. But the proviso is print it out in black and white to make sure that those colours translate to monochrome and that you still have a successful looking CV when that's done. So do that as well. Work experience is always a tricky one. Some people have done so many things, you wonder how on earth they managed to actually get an education. Where did they find the time? And other people have done nothing, right? And you may not have done anything because you've been working, you've been focusing on school, or maybe those opportunities weren't available to you. I mean, 30 odd years ago, when I was applying for jobs, I'd had loads of part-time jobs as a teenager. Actually, that's really hard now. There are very few part-time jobs for young people to take. And, you know, if that opportunity isn't there, well, what are you going to put down? What are you going to add here? So anything that you've done that has given you the opportunity to, I don't know, maybe take some leadership or do some organising or anything, even if it's not paid employment, is worth putting here as work experience. So start with the most relevant. So this is where I'm deviating from the idea of a master CV. You should write a master CV that has everything on it, okay? And that will probably go over 2 pages, that's fine. When you actually then rejig that CV for a particular job application, that's where this phrase most relevant is really important. Because if they're looking for a programmer and they want somebody that programs in C++, then that, and if you've done that, then that is the thing that has to go at the top of every list. If you've had a job as an intern where programming with C++ was key, then that has to be, as work experience, that has to be the first thing that you put in there. So you move things around depending on which job you're applying for. So start with the most relevant at the point where you're now rejigging your CV for an actual job application. Write in full sentences here, but keep it brief and focused. So you don't have to wax lyrical about every aspect of the job that you've been doing. Think carefully about what you're applying for and think about the kind of things that that potential employer is going to be looking for. There are loads of examples online of how to do this, so I'm not going to spend time on it here. Keep it brief and focused, and the most important thing is proofread carefully. Okay, now I'm rubbish at spotting my own mistakes. I will read them over and over again and not see them at all, not unless I've walked away from a document for a week or longer, and then I might see them. Give it to someone else, right? We all are often blind to the mistakes that we've made. Give it to someone else to proofread for you, and they'll spot it immediately, and that's really important. And the final thing I've put here is soft skills or hard skills. And by that, I mean, you may be able to operate a till at a checkout in a supermarket. So that's a hard skill. The soft skill is being able to chat to the customers while you're doing it. A hard skill might be being able to, I don't know, let's say that you've worked in a repair shop and you know how to repair computers, for example. So that's the hard skill. The soft skill is the ability to talk to customers on the phone and find out through careful questioning exactly what is wrong with their machine, and ascertain how likely you are to be able to fix it and roughly what the cost might be. There's your soft skill, your ability to talk and communicate. So remember, it's not just about the actual physical things that you can do, it's also about all those periphery skills that come into play. So make sure you think about those and write about them as well. So work experience, if you haven't had any, then there may be other things that you've done. So you may have been a member of a club or society at school or university, and all of those things count. Okay. It's not unusual for students not to have any specific work experience, and so that's why these things can be important, because they show the same hard and soft skills very often. You just don't think of them as work, so that needs to go in here. And I've put here things that demonstrate soft skills: leadership skills, ability to work independently or as part of a team. So those things are actually really important. There's a link on this slide to a nice quite a nice website that I found yesterday that gives you some ideas of how you might describe your skills. There are lots and lots out there, actually. I mean, I could have, I did a Google search, as you do, and there, I could have picked one of 50 sites easily. This happened to be one I quite like the look of, clicked on it, could see that it was quite useful. So here it is, but there's masses of other ones out there as well. So as I said, your hard and soft skills. So there's a couple of statements here. And actually, this is about me. This is the kind of thing that I might write. I like to work on ideas as part of a team, and I'm cooperative and supportive. I prefer to work through problems independently. I'm determined and tenacious. And that is me, right? If I have a problem to solve, I prefer to just take it away and do it on my own. I don't want to be part of a team doing that. I find that very distracting. What I like being part of a group in is when we're asked to come up with ideas as ways of tackling a problem, for example, because I'm not very much of an original thinker. But if somebody sparks me off, I'm away, right? I can do it. I just can't, I struggle with the initial thing. So those are two statements that might apply to me, that I might put in as part of my work sentences supporting work experience. I also used bold and italics to emphasize keywords. Okay, so actually this can work really well, because what anybody will do, they see your CV and their eye will be drawn to those words that are in bold and in italics. And if you do it with enough care, you can lead somebody through all your key skills and attributes without them actually having to read the CV word for word. So that can be quite a powerful way of getting some key information across. You can also use colour, but again, take care, because if it's printed out in black and white, the impact of colour is going to be lost. You also kind of want to avoid looking as if you've just tried to be too clever. And that is a very subjective judgment, I realise that. but it's it's easy to overdo things, I guess, is what I'm saying. And if you're not confident, pare it back to the essentials. So bold, italics, black and white, spacing, layout, those kind of things, and leave color alone. Just stick to those basic things. So when we're talking about work experience, previous experience, if you're still a student, anything counts. Any potential employer will realise that your opportunity for previous experience, whether it's work or something else, is probably quite limited. And so anything that you've done is worthwhile. But of course, the thing that you need to do is get some. You need to get some experience, because you need something that you can talk about in an interview. You need something for a potential employer to look at your CV and say, I see you did this for your third year project. You created this website. Tell me about it. So those are the things that you need to be able to talk about. So if you haven't got anything, find opportunities to get it. Even if it's volunteer, right? Volunteer in a charity shop or something, but do something that you can talk about in an interview. Because it's not just thinking about how you present yourself, but you're also trying to think about how a potential employer is going to talk to you, the kind of things that they're going to ask, the things they want to know. And you want to come across as a rounded human being. And so other things over and above just your basic educational qualifications is really important. So do something, whatever it might be, do it. Find something to get involved in. So finally, and I've said this a couple of times, it's better to spread your CV over 2 sheets, 2 sides of A4, than squeeze it onto one. And think about where you're going to put that page break. So if you're listing your skills, for example, or previous experience, put all of that onto a new page rather than break it halfway through. So think about that. Get someone else to proofread. So when you think you've done, hand it to someone else and get them to have a look for you, because they'll spot the mistakes, they'll spot the errors, they'll spot the spelling mistakes. And my final one here is use a spell checker. Right, it's the easiest thing in the world, and I'm always surprised at why some people don't make the most of it. Every single piece of software has it. Use it, okay? Use it. So I'm not, it's not always 100% accurate. The English language is tricky, and there's some anomalies in there, but use it. And then when you think you've used it, give it to someone else for a bit of a proofread as well. And of course, this is especially important when English isn't your first language. It's really important there. And finally, I've mentioned this already, but write a master CV. So everything will be on that CV. Review it regularly and add information as you can. So the moment you've done something new, pop it onto your CV. And then when you're applying for a job, tailor it to the job that you're applying for. So rejig it, reshuffle things around, bring JavaScript to the top and put C++ further down. Or if you've been using Visual Studio and that's important, get that up there and move something else a bit further down, so that the person's eye is drawn to the important things. And finally, this is really important. So sending out your CV is a bit like taking your first child to school. Ask your parents what that was like if you don't have a child of your own. You've got no idea what's going to happen to your application and your CV, right? You've got no idea. You've just let it off into the wild, and you've got no control over the next part of the process. There will probably be gatekeepers who will be scanning through all the applications and basically binning a lot of them before it even gets to the next stage. You don't know who they are. You don't know how they're doing the job. They don't know anything about you either, by the way. So it's, there's no agenda here. It's just, this is the way things are. But you have no control over it. And so there's no point sweating over it and getting upset or worrying about what's going to happen next, because it's out of your hands, right? You've done it now. That's it. The worst case scenario for any job you apply for is that there's an internal candidate who is very strong, and the company are going through the motions, really just doing that final check to make sure that maybe there's nobody out there more qualified, or maybe they have to because this is company policy, in which case, even if you got to an interview, you'd work very hard to beat that candidate. I mean, this is the way things are. You could argue it's unfair, but that's how life is sometimes. And again, you know, you've got no control over this process, so don't take it too personally. The best outcome, the best case scenario, is that your CV and your letter of application, because inevitably we have to do one of those as well, is good enough to get you an interview, and then you're through to the next stage. And then there's a whole load of other things that you can do to prepare for your interview. But what we want ideally is for your CV to make it through to that stage. And again, you've got no control over the process. You've got no idea what's going to happen with it. So even if your CV is beautiful and perfect and everything is lovely, you've got no guarantee that it's going to go through to the next step, and you mustn't be disheartened if it doesn't, because sometimes we have no idea why that is the case. You know, it's just that is just life, I'm afraid, and you know, you just pick yourself up and you try again somewhere else. So that ends my chat about CVs.